Would you like to make beautiful hand-knit Christmas trees that you can use to decorate your home this Christmas? I'll show you how to make them in 6 different sizes using a free, easy pattern and a few basic supplies. Grab your needles and let's get started. There are just a few supplies you'll need to start this project. You'll need medium weight number 4 yarn, Aran weight or worsted weight will work, knitting needles in a size US 9 or 5.5 millimeters. I'm using circular needles, but double pointed needles will work as well. You'll need 6 stitch markers, a pair of scissors to snip the yarn, and a darning needle to weave in the ends. You'll also want to download the knitting pattern for these trees. I've put the link in the description below where you can download and print them completely free from my website. So we'll start by casting on with a long tail cast on. I'm knitting the size small tree, so I'm casting on 40 stitches total. If you're knitting a different size tree from what I'm knitting here, you'll need to cast on the number of stitches that's specified in the pattern. There are anywhere from 30 for the mini tree to 120 stitches for the jumbo sized one. So check the pattern and make sure you're casting on the number that you want for the tree size you want to end up with. As we're casting on, we're going to be placing our markers at evenly spaced intervals around the cast on stitches. So in this case, we're casting on 40 stitches total, so we'll place our markers every 8 stitches. The number of stitches that you need between markers changes depending on the size of the tree that you're going to end up with. So don't forget to check the pattern and make sure that you're placing the markers at the right spot as you cast on. It took a few minutes to cast on, so let's just skip ahead to the end. Ta-da! Once we're all done, we should have 5 sections with 8 stitches in each section, for a total of 40 stitches. Now we can move on to knitting the ribbing. Okay, time to start the ribbing. I'll start by double checking that I have the right number of stitches on the needles. In this case I need 40 stitches, and that's what I've got. I'm moving half of the stitches onto the left-hand needle and leaving the other half on the cord of the circular needles. The 2 tail pieces of yarn should be on the far right of your circular needle cord. This part can be a little tricky, so just be really careful that you don't twist any of the cast-on stitches when you bring that cord up to meet the left-hand needle. You want the edges that we just cast on to be facing in so that they both meet in the middle. If you don't already have a stitch marker there, you can slip a stitch marker onto the right hand needle. And now we're just going to start knitting our rib pattern. For this size of tree, we're knitting 3 stitches and then purl 1. The only size of tree that's different for is the mini one, where we'll knit only 2 stitches and then purl 1. But for this one, it's knit 3, purl 1. I always like to knit in the tails into the first couple of stitches. That way it saves some of the weaving in time later on. We'll just keep knitting that ribbing pattern all the way around. Knit 3, purl 1, knit 3, purl 1, all the way around until we have a total of 9 rows. You don't need to do anything special when you get to the marker. Just slip it from the left needle onto the right needle and continue your ribbing pattern. We're not using the markers in the ribbing rows. Okay, so we're all done our 9 rows of ribbing. I'm just going to double check that we do in fact have 9 rows here by counting the stitches vertically. And don't forget that the 9 rows includes the row that is on the cord currently. It does not include that very first loop at the bottom, because that was part of the cast on. Counting the rows might seem like a bit of a hassle, but trust me, it's a lot easier than having to rip out rows when you realize later on that you've made a mistake. Once we're sure we've got all 9 rows of ribbing, we can move on to doing the first decrease row. Okay, so we're on to the first row of decreases. We're going to be decreasing the total number of stitches on the needles by a total of 10 stitches, and that's the same no matter which size of tree you're knitting. So what we're going to do is use a central decrease to decrease the stitches by 2 before each of the 5 markers, for a total of 10 stitches decreased. I know that might sound a little bit confusing, but just hold on, I'm going to show you. It's not as hard as it sounds. We're going to start this row by knitting 2 stitches. I like to put a stitch marker onto the second stitch. That'll make it easy to find the decrease row as we knit on. And I put the marker on the second stitch because we're going to use that first stitch at the end of this row. Now we'll continue knitting until we have 3 stitches left before the next marker. Once we have only 3 stitches left before the next marker, we're going to do our first central decrease. So to do a central decrease, you're going to stick your needle up through the first 2 stitches on the left needle and slide them onto the right needle. Then you'll knit that third stitch, just as usual. Then take the left needle and poke it through the 2 stitches that we just slipped and pull them over top of the stitch we just knit. And that's our first central decrease. That will have reduced the number of stitches on the needles by 2. Then we slip off the marker, knit 1 more stitch, and place the marker back on the right hand needle. And then we're going to repeat the whole process for the next section. So knit until you have 3 stitches left on the marker. And then we'll do our central decrease. So again, poke the right needle up through the 2 stitches on the end of the left needle and pull them off. Then knit a stitch as usual. Then poke the left needle down into those 2 stitches that we just slipped and pull them over top of the knit stitch. That's the end of the central decrease. So then we're going to take our marker off, knit 1 more stitch, and put the marker back on the right hand needle. There we go. So now we've done 2 decreases. So we're just going to continue doing that around all 5 sections until we come back to the end of this row. Here we're on the last decrease of the first decrease row. So we're going to do the same thing as we've done with every other decrease. Slip 2 stitches, knit 1, pull those 2 slip stitches back over top of the knit stitch. And that's our central decrease. Now on this last decrease, you'll find that after you do the central decrease, remove the marker, there's no stitch left to knit. So in this case, we're going to knit that very first stitch from the beginning of the row. This is why, remember I said to put the marker on the second stitch of the row instead of the first one for the row marker? This is why, because we're going to use that very first stitch as the last stitch, if that makes sense. You can just slip the section marker back on the right hand needle, and that's it. We're all done the decrease row. So now all we do is keep knitting. You don't have to do anything special for the next 9 rows. Just slip those section markers from the left needle to the right needle. We're not doing anything with them on the knitting rows, only on the decrease rows. So start knitting, and you can always count back to that row marker that we hung on that stitch, which is why we put it there. You can also keep track of your rows as you go using a row counter, which is probably the proper way to do it, but I'm really bad at clicking the row counter at the end of every row, and I find it just more confusing. So I always put that extra marker at the beginning of the decrease row so that I can always count back easily and make sure that I've actually knitted 9 rows before we do our next decrease row. I'm all finished knitting the 9 knit rows, and I'm just double checking that I do in fact have 9 rows, not counting the row with the marker on it, but including the stitches that are currently on the needles. Now we're on to the second decrease row, and it's exactly the same as the first one. So we're going to knit our first 2 stitches, and then take that row marker from the first decrease row and place it onto the second stitch in our second decrease row. These are actually jewelry links, not stitch markers that I'm using, so they're a little bit fiddly to get on and off, but they work. And then we'll keep knitting the stitches until we have 3 stitches left on the needle before the next marker. And we'll do our first central decrease for this row. So we slide 2 off, knit 1, pull the 2 that we just slid back over top of the knit one and off the needle. Then we remove the marker, knit 1 stitch, and replace the marker. And that's it. So we'll keep doing those for each section, and we'll end up with 5 decreases on this row, just the same as we did with the first one. As we come to the end of the second decrease row, we're going to do the same thing we did in the first decrease row, where we use that first stitch from the row as the last stitch from this row. So you'll have to slide it from your left hand needle up a little bit and knit that stitch before the row marker as your last stitch. Slip the marker back onto the right hand needle, and that's the end of the second decrease row. Now we'll just continue knitting and knit another 9 rows, the same as we did before, and then do another decrease row, knit another 9 rows, decrease, knit 9 rows. How many times you have to do that depends on the size of tree you're knitting. But no matter which size tree you're knitting, your last row of decreases will be when you have 20 stitches total on your needles, so 4 stitches between each of the 5 sections. Here we are on the last decrease row, and we know it's the last decrease row because there are a total of 20 stitches left, or 4 stitches between each of the sections. And that's the same no matter which size tree you're knitting. So at this point, I would replace the row marker so that we have that to mark our decrease row. But as you come to each section marker, you can slip them off if you like. That's what I'm doing here. You can leave them on too, it won't hurt anything, but I usually slip them off because we don't need them anymore after this point. We have just finished our last decrease row, so at this point we have a total of 10 stitches on the needles. I replaced the row marker on the last decrease row, but we removed the section markers as we went because we don't need them anymore. So we'll just finish by knitting 5 more rows to form the top point of the Christmas tree. With the last 5 rows knitted, all we have to do now is weave in the ends of the yarn. So we'll use the scissors to snip the yarn and then thread it onto a darning needle. Starting with the first 5 stitches, you can just push the darning needle through and pull the yarn all the way through, making sure that the tail doesn't get stuck in the stitches. Now you can slip those first 5 stitches right off the needles because the yarn that we just threaded through will hold them in place. And then turn the piece over. And again, push the darning needle through the stitches that are left on the knitting needle cord. And now you can pull the last of the stitches right off of your knitting needles. The yarn will hold everything in place. Give the yarn a firm tug to close up the hole at the top of the tree, and then you can take off that last decrease row marker. The very last thing to do is to weave in the ends of the yarn. So we'll put the yarn back on the darning needle and then push it through the hole at the top of the tree and flip the whole thing inside out. Then you can use the darning needle to weave in the end of the yarn, following the path of some of the stitches that are already there. Once the top piece of yarn is woven in, you can just snip it with the scissors, and we'll weave in the bottom piece of yarn as well. If you remember back to the very beginning, when we first started knitting the ribbing rows, we knitted in a few stitches with the tail of the yarn in it. So this tail is actually already woven in. I just like to weave a few more stitches to keep it up and out of the way so it's not hanging out the bottom of the tree. Then we'll snip off that last piece of yarn and flip the whole tree right side out, and we're finished. You can block the finished tree to make it look a bit more professional, or you can just leave it as is and put it directly onto a cone form. The finished trees look so pretty displayed together in a group. Of course, you can customize them by making them in any color or type of yarn that you like. You can also decorate your finished trees with beads, baubles, pom-poms, whatever you like. I love that these handmade decorations can be used year after year. And when the holidays are over, you can take them off their cone forms, fold them up, and store them away for next year. Thanks so much for watching. If you love arts and crafts as much as I do, don't forget to check out my channel for more fun ideas. See you soon!